In a museum in London, there's a human ribcage on display, permanently bent out of its natural shape, not from disease, not from injury, from a piece of ordinary clothing, worn every single day for years by a woman simply trying to look fashionable. This is the history of the corset, and what it actually did to the women wearing it. Corsets didn't start out as anything sinister. In the 1500s, European women began wearing stiffened bodices, reinforced internally with strips of whalebone or thin wood, mainly to support the torso and create a smooth, structured foundation underneath formal clothing. Wealthy women wore them daily, while working women often owned simpler, less rigid versions suited to physical labor. For roughly 2 centuries, this was simply how structured fashion worked, not dramatically different in principle from how a modern suit jacket relies on internal structure to hold its shape, and it wasn't yet considered a health concern by most physicians of the era. Then, in 1828, a small technical innovation in France quietly changed everything about how far a corset could realistically be pushed. Manufacturers introduced reinforced metal eyelets into corset lacing, replacing the simple hand-stitched fabric holes used before. Fabric alone couldn't reliably withstand extreme tension without eventually tearing apart under the strain. Metal could hold indefinitely, no matter how hard the laces were pulled. For the first time in the garment's long history, corsets could be laced dramatically tighter than ever before, and the fashionable hourglass silhouette exploded in popularity almost immediately across Europe and America. Some women, chasing that exaggerated, dramatically cinched shape, laced their waists down to 17 inches or smaller, roughly the circumference of an average human neck, an extreme most bodies were never naturally built to achieve without serious, sustained pressure. Doctors noticed almost right away that something was wrong. In 1793, decades before the metal eyelet even existed, a physician named von Sommerring had already published a paper called On the Effects of the Corset, arguing that tightly bound stays compressed the ribs and organs underneath, based on his own anatomical observations. Once tight lacing became genuinely fashionable in the Victorian era, doctors documented the pattern constantly, in journal after journal, decade after decade. Women laced tightly enough often struggled to breathe fully, since the diaphragm physically couldn't expand the way it needed to during normal respiration. Fainting became common enough in fashionable society that homes began keeping dedicated fainting couches specifically for this reason, a piece of furniture that owes its very existence to a garment. Digestion suffered too, since compressed abdominal organs simply couldn't function the way an unconstrained body naturally would. Over years of continuous daily wear, the back muscles that should have supported the spine on their own gradually began to weaken and atrophy, since the corset was now quietly doing that structural work instead, day after day. Doctors even gave a specific medical name to the pale, weak, breathless condition many corset-wearing women developed over time. They called it chlorosis, or green sickness, and treated it with iron pills and prescribed rest, without always connecting the diagnosis back to the actual cause laced tightly around their patient's ribs every single morning. If a piece of everyday clothing was doing this much damage in plain sight, imagine what happened to the women who took it even further. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what fashion history conveniently left out, hit subscribe now. We dig up stories exactly like this one every single week. That ribcage in the museum I mentioned at the start sits in London's Hunterian Museum, and it's a genuine physical example of exactly what decades of tight lacing could do to a real human skeleton. The lower ribs in that specimen curve inward at an angle they were never naturally meant to hold, permanently reshaped by years of steady pressure applied every single day. In 1908, a French physician named Ludovic O'Followill took this evidence even further, using the still new technology of X-ray photography to capture direct, undeniable images of women's rib cages, both with and without corsets laced tightly around them for comparison. His images, published in a detailed 2-volume study, showed clearly altered rib positioning and visibly compressed space for the organs sitting underneath. For the first time in medical history, the damage wasn't just theoretical or based on second-hand description from a worried physician. It was visible, on film, undeniable, and impossible for skeptics to simply argue away. And yet, here's where the story gets more complicated than most people expect, and honestly, more interesting. Modern fashion historians, after years of careful, painstaking research through original garments, medical journals, and hospital records, have pushed back hard against some of the more extreme claims that grew up around corsetry over time. One popular myth claims that Victorian women routinely had their lower ribs surgically removed to achieve a smaller waist. Fashion historian Valerie Steele, who has spent decades studying original garments and period medical records at the Fashion Institute of Technology, has stated plainly and repeatedly that there is no evidence this procedure ever actually happened, anywhere, to anyone. Surgery in that era, without reliable anesthesia and without any real understanding of infection control, would have been extraordinarily dangerous and simply doesn't appear anywhere in the actual surviving medical literature of the period, despite the myth's persistence right up to today. Historians now also believe that most ordinary women never laced anywhere near as extremely as popular imagination tends to suggest. The 17-inch waist was a genuine but relatively rare extreme, chased by a small, fashion-obsessed minority, not the daily lived experience of the average Victorian woman simply getting dressed for an ordinary day at home. Still, not as extreme as the myth doesn't mean harmless, and it would be a mistake to swing too far in the other direction either. The real medical record is clear enough entirely on its own, without any exaggeration needed. The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world then and now, published articles on the dangers of tight lacing regularly for decades, including a piece in June of 1890 titled bluntly, "Death from Tight Lacing," followed by further articles in 1892 and again in 1909, spanning nearly 20 years of continued medical concern. Real women really did die, in documented recorded cases, from the practice, even if it wasn't the constant, universal, everyday danger that later folklore sometimes made it sound like. The truth sits in an uncomfortable middle ground that doesn't make for quite as clean a headline, but is far more historically honest. So here's the actual, more complicated truth sitting underneath this story. The corset wasn't secretly harmless, the way some modern defenders like to claim, but it also wasn't the cartoonish, organ-crushing torture device of exaggerated legend either. It sat somewhere in between, a genuinely damaging garment for the women who wore it most extremely, and a milder but still real strain on the women who wore it more moderately, all in service of a beauty standard that very few bodies could naturally achieve without artificial help. That pattern, if you think about it, never fully disappeared. Waist training became a genuine modern trend, promoted heavily by celebrities and influencers online, using modern latex and elastic versions of essentially the same core idea, the same promise of a smaller waist, achieved through consistent, prolonged compression. Doctors today raise many of the same concerns von Sommerring first raised back in 1793, about restricted breathing, weakened core muscles, and long-term physical dependence on the garment itself, more than 200 years apart, aimed at the exact same basic human desire to reshape the body into something fashion currently demands. Think about the full arc of this story. A practical, supportive garment from the 1500s, a single metal eyelet innovation in 1828 that quietly enabled real, lasting physical harm. A museum ribcage in London that still shows the damage today, generations after the woman who wore that corset has been forgotten, and a modern industry still selling the exact same basic promise wrapped in slightly gentler, more forgiving materials. If nobody ever taught you the real, complicated story behind this one, imagine how many other pieces of everyday clothing have histories just as tangled. Subscribe if you want more of them, and tell me in the comments whether you'd heard the rib removal myth before today. I read every single one. Next week, we're uncovering why women's asylums were quietly filled with patients who were never actually sick at all.